All right.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. And thank you guys all for coming. It's wonderful, as always, to have such great attendance for these lectures we do. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Candelara. I'm 22, and I serve as the editor-in-chief for the Dartmouth Apologia. And I'm just going to start with a brief introduction of what the Apologia is, and then I'll pass it over to Joe to introduce Dr. Davis. So the Dartmouth Apologia is the Christian apologetics journal on campus, and we exist to basically contextualize Christianity in an academic setting. And we endeavor to think critically and question honestly, and to, as I mentioned, articulate Christian perspectives at Dartmouth through our magazine, through these lectures, and through informal discussions that we frequently have on campus. We publish a magazine twice a year, once in the fall, once in the spring. And the articles we publish are we're not looking to publish the Summa Theologica, part 2, right? We look to publish articles that help, to contextualize worldviews and to answer some of the quote unquote big questions in life through Christian doctrine and through Christianity. So that could be anything from, is religion recreation to, the historical argument or the historicity of Christianity and socialism, et cetera. It could be any, any sort of topics like that. We are accepting articles for our spring issue that we're going to publish at the beginning of the spring term. So if you have an article or a paper that you wrote for a class that you'd like to publish that could be adapted to our magazine, feel free to email me or go on our website to find our email. I'll put that in the chat, and yeah, just get in touch if you'd like to write. And with that, I'll pass it over to Joe.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Chris. Before I introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Ted Davis, I'll just give a quick breakdown of how this lecture will be formatted. So Dr. Davis will be delivering his lecture in 2 15-minute chunks, and between every chunk will allow for about 10 minutes of open floor Q&A session. And I'll explain more about how we'll format that in a moment, but let me introduce our guest speaker now. So Dr. Ted Davis is a distinguished professor of the history of science at Messiah University. His education crosses the gap between the sciences and the humanities. Dr. Davis initially studied physics, earning his degree in physics from Drexel University, and intending to become an astrophysicist. However, as he learned more about science and Christianity after college, he decided to pursue graduate study in the history of science. Dr. Davis earned his PhD in history and philosophy of science from Indiana University. His works and publications mostly deal with aspects of the scientific revolution, especially the life and work of the great chemist Robert Boyle, or with science and religion in modern America, especially in the period between the 2 world wars. Without further ado, please join me in giving a warm virtual round of applause to Dr. Ted Davis.
Thank you very much, Joe, and to each of you for turning out this afternoon to do this instead of watching a football game or something else. Before I begin, let me simply state that there's a context in which this talk was originally given, a version not too different from this one, a context that would account for something. The context was a debate with a secular humanist minister at Oregon State University, where there is a debate society, and they host monthly events involving a theist and a non-theist on various different topics. So I knew in that context, objections to my argument were likely to arise. I was going to leave it to my opponent to do that, rather than to try to present a fuller picture of the history of Christianity and science in which one could show examples that would suggest there have been moments of tension. And if you want to ask me about any of that, we can do that in the sessions where we're asking questions. So this, in other words, this will sound like a one-sided argument, and that was intentional in the context. Of course, in a 20-minute or 30-minute presentation, it would be really hard to try to comment on 2,000 years of Christianity and science and not be extremely selective. I'm sure you all understand that. So with that context in mind, let me begin with this, my all-time favorite image related to Christianity and science. This shows God as a mathematician designing the world. It's a 13th century manuscript illumination in the Austrian National Library. And you can see the unformed Earth in the center with the sun and the moon around it in the cutaway view of the cosmos. You'll see this picture again partway through. Sadly, the public conversation about religion and science today is often dominated by shrill, uninformed voices who demonize and insult their opponents, marginalize alternative views in an effort to polarize, and bend the truth until it breaks. We can do a lot better than that. As an historian of science with particular expertise in science and religion, I have a different view of this than many commentators. Although the historical landscape is not entirely absent of conflicts involving religion and science, the general picture is substantially unlike the popular conception of ongoing inevitable conflict that is promoted by certain preachers of atheism. Quite the opposite. I will argue that Christian faith often complements the picture of the world coming from the sciences, helping us to achieve a deeper understanding of both the way the world is and how we ought to go about understanding the world, while providing a powerful motive for investigating nature. The Christian doctrine of creation helps us to understand more of reality than science alone can study, including the very possibility of science itself as a form of knowledge about nature. Now, the tone of my position is no less important than the content. I am not trying to show that every open-minded, well-informed, rational person must draw the same conclusions that I draw. There are no slam dunk answers to jump shot questions, and questions about the existence of God, the intelligibility of nature, or the meaning of life are of just that sort. The enormous success of science in explaining so many features of the natural world is partly a result of limiting its methods and scope to things that can be measured and tested against nature, deliberately leaving all other matters to one side, but not, I would argue, debunking those matters as meaningless. Now, Richard Dawkins vehemently disagrees with the point I just made about not debunking other matters. When he asked himself rhetorically, what is the meaning of life? This was his answer. If science has nothing to say, it's certain that no other discipline can say anything at all. Now, the arrogance of such a claim, dismissing in 17 words the significance of all art, music, literature, and anything else any person has ever thought about the question, apart from science, of course, is staggering. However, Dawkins doesn't really speak for the whole scientific community when he says such things. He speaks only for himself and for those who happen to agree with him. A different opinion comes from the late Peter Medawar, a Nobel laureate biologist who, like Dawkins, did not believe in God. The existence of a limit to science is made clear by its inability to answer childlike questions having to do with first and last things. Questions such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the purpose, the point of living? It is not to science, therefore, but to metaphysics, imaginative literature, or religion that we must turn for answers to questions having to do with first and last things. It is now to a few of those first and last things that I want to turn. I'll start with a famous statement from the greatest scientist of the last century, Albert Einstein. The most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible. He was referring implicitly to two different points, different aspects of nature, its regularity and the fact that our minds can delve deeply into it, producing a coherent picture of reality. Both of these things are prerequisites for the very possibility of doing science, and they happen to match perfectly the biblical notion of creation. Now, what exactly do I mean by creation? An idea that might easily be misunderstood if I don't spell it out. Harvard-trained astrophysicist and theologian Christopher Kaiser puts it like this. The basic idea of creation in Scripture is that the entire universe is subject to a code of law, which was established at the beginning of time. This idea has two major implications for our view of the world. One, nature functions with a high degree of autonomy, meaning literally having its own laws. That's what the word autonomy means. And second, the natural world is comprehended by God and therefore comprehensible to human beings created in the divine image. Now, I lack time to expand on Kaiser's claim with specific passages from the Bible and the great theologians. Suffice it to say that the Latin term lex naturae, the English law of nature, appears very early in Christian thought, no later than the 4th century, when Ambrose used it in a Latin paraphrase of the Hexameron, the commentary on the days of creation, by Basil of Caesarea, one of the great Greek fathers. Christian theologians made the concept of law of nature commonplace long before scientists picked up the terminology. Precisely because it has such strong theological overtones, philosopher of science Nancy Cartwright, a prominent atheist, has even recommended that scientists stop using the language and concept of laws of nature altogether. As she says, without God, there cannot be laws of nature, nor anything else with their crucial characteristics. Now, Cartwright's conclusion flatly contradicts a widely publicized claim by astrophysicist Lawrence Krauss, who describes himself as a, quote, anti-theist, unquote. According to Krauss, advances in cosmology and particle physics have, to quote him, made it clear that there's a plausible case for understanding precisely how a universe full of stuff, like the universe we live in, could result literally from nothing by natural processes. And therefore, we don't need a creator. Frankly, this is all bluster. Krauss's pronouncement goes far beyond science, immersing him in philosophical and theological waters that are much deeper than he realizes. David Albert, an atheistic philosopher of physics at Columbia, deftly exposed Krauss's astonishing naivete in the New York Times, concluding that none of Krauss's ideas amount to anything even remotely in the neighborhood of a creation from nothing. Physicist Paul Davies is equally unimpressed by claims of this sort. As he says, it is all very well proclaiming that the laws of physics plus the cosmic initial conditions explain the universe. But this begs the question of where those laws and conditions came from in the first place. Science may be powerfully successful in explaining the universe, but how do we explain science? Why does science, based on the notion of external laws of physics, work and works so well? Now, many natural laws are expressed mathematically. The great astronomer James Jeans once said that as our knowledge advanced, the universe begins to look more like a great thought than like a great machine. This particular feature of the universe also has strong theological overtones, leading countless Jewish and Christian scientists quote a creation text from the apocryphal Book of Wisdom. Thou hast ordained all things in measure and number and weight. Frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if this were the most frequently cited verse in all of biblical literature on the part of scientists historically. It is not simply, of course, the fact that we can understand the universe. There's something else here that's more remarkable, something going on that this picture suggests, something about how we understand the universe. Many years ago, Nobel laureate Eugene Wigner wrote a famous paper with a fascinating title. Some of you have probably read it. It's called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. And here's how he put it. The enormous usefulness of mathematics in the natural sciences is something bordering on the mysterious, and there's no rational explanation for it. With mathematics, we can probe very deeply into matter and far out into the universe in ways that are completely unanticipated and yet incredibly accurate. Wigner puts it like this: the mathematical formulation of the physicist's often crude experience leads in an uncanny number of cases to an amazingly accurate description of a large class of phenomena. For him, this shows that the mathematical language has more to commend it than being the only language we can speak. It shows that it is, in a very real sense, the correct language. I actually know, or knew at one time, knew many years ago when I was an assistant of his, the director of the SETI project, the project looking for extraterrestrial life, astronomer Seth Shostak. Seth doesn't believe in God. However, as cosmologist John Barrow has noted, the whole SETI project assumes, as Barrow puts it, that mathematics is a universal language. Carl Sagan obviously thought that was the case, judging from his novel Contact, in which extraterrestrial beings make their presence known to us by using the prime number sequence. Of course, this could only be possible if mathematics is the same at other times as well as in other places. The seemingly universal presence of mathematics in nature is a profound fact about our encounter with the universe, and it cries out for a deeper explanation. If mathematics is merely a human invention, and our minds are nothing more than the product of a blind evolutionary process that guarantees only our survival, not the truth of our mathematical propositions, then why do our equations describe nature so well? As Paul Davies has observed, survival depends on an appreciation of how the world is, not of any hidden underlying order. Certainly, it cannot depend on the hidden order within atomic nuclei, or in black holes, or in subatomic particles that are produced on Earth only inside particle accelerator machines. All of this suggests that mathematics has some element of transcendence about it, suggesting in turn the possibility of a transcendent cause of the match between mathematics and matter. Is it perhaps the case, as Kepler, Jeans, Galileo, and Copernicus believed, that God is a mathematician? Well, here I'm with physicist John Polkinghorne, who says there's no a priori reason why beautiful equations should prove to be the clue to understanding nature. Why fundamental physics should be possible. Why our minds should have such ready access to the deep structure of the universe. It is a contingent fact that this is true of us and of our world, but it does not seem sufficient simply to regard it as a happy accident. Surely it is a significant insight into the nature of reality. This seems like a good point at which to stop for our first break. I've been talking about mathematical laws. When I resume, we'll talk about laws more broadly and leave mathematics behind.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Davis. So now we'll allow for a few minutes of questions that anybody has to ask. So what we'll do is if you want to, if you go to the participants button on your screen, and if you click the raised hand button, we'll be able to see if you have questions. Alternatively, you can just private message your questions, either myself or Dr. Davis, if you prefer to do it that way, and you can read anonymously. So we'll give you a moment to type out or raise your hands if you have a question. Looks like Anthony, you have a question? You can unmute yourself if you'd like.
Hi, Dr. Davis. Thank you so much for coming and, or I guess logging on and speaking to us. So you mentioned a couple of important scientists who have, I guess, accepted the notion that science can't explain ultimately everything. And it seems like often in these conversations, something that the theist might say is, well, the idea that Christians are irrational seems to be defeated by the fact that we have very rational Christians. You know, especially if you're talking to a scientist, you can say many scientists who seem to be more successful, like Lemaitre with his Big Bang Theory and whatnot. Do you think that that is a good way of arguing for the rationality of the Christian position, by pointing out that there are immensely successful scientifically minded Christians?
To a limited extent, yes. I think it's helpful to recognize it as a fact. As a historian, I would note that when modern science is created in the 16th and 17th centuries, that's almost entirely within a Christian context. It's really science as we practice it today is largely put together then, and it's put together in certain parts of Europe, not Europe as a whole. It doesn't mean it was entire isolation from other influences, including important influences from the Islamic world. And I don't mean to suggest that, but it is something that was created in early modern Europe. It was not created in any other place in the world at that time. And early modern Europe was a predominantly Christian world. So that should suggest at least that the notion of some inherent conflict between science and faith is historically not a dog that's going to hunt, if you want to put it that way. In the contemporary world, of course, a majority of scientists in the United States are agnostic or atheist. If polling data is believable, I'm not an expert myself on the data, I'm not a sociologist, but if the polling data is believable, then pretty much throughout the 20th century, about 40 to 41% of American scientists affirm belief in a God to whom one can pray in expectation of receiving an answer, which sounds like a theist. And about close to 60% did not affirm that, although quite a number of those people just didn't think they knew. So it's a majority of American scientists have not been believers in God, but about 40% have been and apparently still are as a percentage. So that's a lot of people, any way you look at it. And so obviously it's not the case that there's some inherent contradiction between believing in God and doing very good science. That's just not the case sociologically or historically. So that I think I'd say in a limited way, I would answer it like that.
Awesome. If you have any other questions, again, feel free to go to the participants button on your bottom bar and click the raise hand button. Otherwise, you can put your message in the chat and direct it either to myself or Dr. Davis. Charlie, do you have a question? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what do you say to, you mentioned the sort of elegance with which mathematical theories can explain reality. What do you say to someone who argues that those sorts of coincidences don't really require a further explanation, that it's perfectly reasonable to accept those as sort of brute facts and sort of move on in our attempts to understand reality? Why should we even be looking for causes there?
I think that's a fair point. I don't agree. I'm not sympathetic with it insofar as I think we should always be looking for deeper explanations. And the spirit of science is going to want to do that and not leave things at the level of brute facts. But that's a possibility. It's certainly a possibility that this is just the way it is and we're never going to know why it's otherwise. And that searching for answers to these things, insofar as it goes beyond science itself, is not going to lead us with any real good idea about what it is. I mean, I do think that's a fair opponent's viewpoint to hold. I just think I'd rather look for deeper answers. And I think that metaphysics based in Christian theism is potentially capable of answering more questions about science itself and about nature than is one that is not. So I think it has more explanatory value to take a position from Christian theism, but not within the realm of science itself, just as long as we're willing to ask the larger questions about science and its success.
I have a question in the chat, Dr. Davis. So to quote it directly, Dr. Caleb Miller has said that there is a growing number of Christian philosophers who believe in God. And so do you foresee more Christian scientists arising in the future?
The last part, please.
Do you see a greater number of Christian scientists arising in the future?
Well, I'm not a prophet. I'm a historian. I'm not going to prognosticate. It is true that I do know Caleb Miller. He's a philosopher. And it is true that there was a resurgence of Christians in philosophy in the second half of the 20th century. Perhaps that's still true. Not being a philosopher, I don't really have a good sense of that. But I do have a good sense that there was in the late 20th century from reading things on philosophy pertaining to that period and from knowing a lot of people who work in philosophy in that period in the second half of the 20th century. That's been a recognized phenomenon. It's partly a result of the influence of Alvin Plantinga, an analytical philosopher who originally taught at Calvin College in Michigan, but finished his career at University of Notre Dame. And he did have a very, very significant influence on changing the demographics among professional philosophers. Some professional philosophers, some of those philosophers who are atheists found that alarming. Others weren't alarmed by it, but I think they would acknowledge that it happened.
Awesome, thank you. I think we have time for one more question if anybody else would like to ask one. Fabricio, you leave your hand raised.
Yes. Hi, I just want to ask, what's the nature of the approach that religion should take to expand science in this case? For example, would be faith or like a more theological approach instead of just reason?
Well, the position I'm taking in this presentation is that what I could broadly call Christian belief, if you want to be more specific about the nature of it, it would be metaphysical beliefs that are highly consistent with Christian theology. That's what I would put it. If I wanted to be more precise, that those kinds of beliefs, which are inimical to Christian reflection on the universe, are also highly conducive to doing good science. So I simply want to leave it at that I think there's a it's not a surprise to me that there even still in the modern world are a lot of really high level scientists who are strong Christian believers. I mean, it's kind of a natural thing for me to think that way, because in the history of Christian tradition, theological reflection on nature has many of the same kinds of ideas in it that science gets in it when it arises in the early modern period.
I do have one more chat question. We can do this real quick, and then we'll move on to the next half of the lecture. So, do you think that is a quote unquote cop out on behalf of science when they get to the point of having no further explanation of the universe, they turn to inventing multiverses?
Okay, I'm about to address that in the next paragraph, actually, and I'll leave some of my comments for that. I do not think it's a cop-out. No, I don't think it's a cop-out. I mean, if you have mathematical theories, and here I'm going to use the word theory in the theoretical sense that we don't know yet they're true at all. If you're going to have, I'll use it as in the conjectural sense. If you have mathematical theories of the universe that at this point are simply should they ever at any point turn out to account for some fundamental feature of nature that otherwise we don't think we could account for, that could give it some explanatory value. I mean, suppose, for example, you had conjectures that could explain why we have a universe of matter rather than antimatter, or why there's a universe at all, and something like that. That might be an interesting conjecture. The problem with these theories at this time is that they're, as far as I can tell, and I'm not a cosmologist, as far as I can tell from reading cosmologists, nobody has yet been able to show that any such universe actually does exist. And I'm a hard-headed empiricist when it comes to doing science. I want to know that these things are real. I'm going to be quoting Galileo in a couple of minutes just to this effect. So I want some evidence that these are real universes, not just universes on paper. But even if that's the case, a universe just on paper, if it can make interesting explanations, it might have some explanatory value, but it still might not be true. Ultimately, an example of this is 19th century ether theories. Every physicist worth their salt in the 19th century believed in the existence, the real existence of an ether, an almost immaterial stuff pervading all of space, through which light and electromagnetic other electromagnetic radiation moved. In other words, as someone put it at the time, if light is a wave, light is an undulation. It must be a subject of the verb to undulate. Okay, something needs to be doing the undulation. So there must be a material medium. And every physics book in the 19th century would discuss this. You could even look up the article on the ether in 19th century editions of Britannica Encyclopedia. This is a good exercise to try if you're interested in this. They're easy to find these days on the internet. 19th century articles on the ether by James Clerk Maxwell, a great physicist. And he gives the density of the ether. He gives its tensile strength, things of this type. He gives physical properties of the ether, mechanical engineering type properties of the ether that he believes have been measured. And then he says the next step is now to detect the Earth's motion through this. And of course, they tried to do that in the late 19th century without any success. And today, physics books only talk about ether, if they do at all, in a historical sidebar. Physicists don't believe in an ether anymore, even though the existence of electromagnetic waves themselves was predicted by ether. Maxwell predicted that electrical mechanical waves exist when nobody yet knew they did, because of his theory of a mechanical ether. So there's a case where you have great explanatory value for a falsity. And that's because we couldn't detect it. So I think it's possible that multiverse will be in that category someday, sidebar in physics books. But it's too hard for me it's way too early for me to be confident about that. So Joe, then let's move back to the slides, right?
Sounds great. Thank you. If you have any other questions, everyone, feel free to save them to the end. We'll have more time for questions then, but take it away.
So let's go back to where we were here. I had just finished up with Polkinghorne and the beauty of nature, mathematical beauty of nature, and whether there's any deeper explanation for that. So whether a law of nature is mathematical or not, scientific laws do summarize an enormous body of observations, giving them conceptual shape while helping us to predict the results of future observations. They arise out of the interplay of reason and experience that lies at the heart of modern science. Although few scientists today are aware of it, there are actually deep connections between theism and the idea that we ought to learn about nature first and foremost by going out and observing it, and not in some other way. Living at a time when we are confronted with enormously speculative claims about an inconceivable number of presently undetectable universes, it's worth remembering something that Galileo's spokesman Salviati said to Simplicio in his famous book about the Copernican system. As Galileo puts it, our discourses must relate to the sensible world and not to one on paper. Now, in our own day, the great cosmologist George Ellis has said exactly the same thing, responding to Sean Carroll's recommendation that we should accept the multiverse hypothesis even without being able to test it empirically. As Ellis puts it, Carroll is basically saying that the rules for doing good science have changed. This is moving the goalposts. Instead of belief in a scientific theory increasing when observational evidence arises to support it, he suggests that theoretical discoveries alone bolster belief. But conclusions arising logically from mathematics need not apply to the real world. Experiments have proved many beautiful and simple theories wrong. Now, one vestige of theology underlying the modern scientific attitude is the presence in most scientific papers of two words, FACTS, facts, and DATA, data. They happen to come from Latin words meaning made and given, silently reminding us that the facts pertain to the things God has made and that the data are given to us by the author of nature. To take this further, I call on Alexander Koyré, a Jewish scholar of great erudition, whose influence on the history of science in the second half of the 20th century was nothing short of profound. Reflecting on the foundational concepts underlying Newton's science, Koyré said this: as we see, empiricism and metaphysics, even a very definite kind of metaphysic, the creationist, are closely linked together. What other means indeed but observation and experience can we possibly use for the study of a world freely created by an infinite God? Now, to see more about where this is coming from, let me talk a little bit about the 17th century, when a great debate took place between people known to philosophers today as the empiricists and the rationalists. And there was a crucial theological component. The rationalists, such as René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, and Gottfried Leibniz, held that reason alone was sufficient to discover the fundamental laws of nature. The empiricists, including Francis Bacon, Robert Boyle, and Isaac Newton, held that science cannot be done in an armchair. Observation and experiment are essential components. This irreducible difference of opinion comes through very clearly in an interesting comment that Leibniz made to Christian Huygens. He said this at one point: "Mr. Boyle spends too much time to be truthful, drawing from an infinity of splendid experiments. No other conclusions than those which he could have taken for principles of nature, which one can certify to be true from reason alone, whereas experiments, no matter how numerous, cannot prove them." He's, of course, getting at what later is called Hume's problem of induction, that even an infinite number of experiments can't prove something with the finality of a syllogism. Leibniz, of course, is right, but this isn't how science is done. So what did Christian theology have to do with this debate about how science should be done? Well, to see that, let's consider something that the ancient Greco-Roman physician Galen had said when he compared the Greek notion of God and creation to the Hebrew notion. Here's how he put it. And when he's saying our opinion, he means the Greeks. He says, "Our own opinion and that of Plato and of the other Greeks who follow the right method in natural science differs from the position taken up by Moses. For Moses, it seems enough to say that God simply willed the arrangement of matter, and it was presently arranged in due order. For he believes everything to be possible with God. We Greeks, however, do not hold this. We say that certain things are impossible by nature, and that God does not even attempt such things, but that he only chooses the best out of the possibilities of becoming." If you hear echoes of Leibniz here, I don't think you're barking up the wrong tree. In other words, Moses' God is free to do things outside the box in which Galen and the Greeks put their gods. In exactly the same way, the rationalists of Boyle's day felt that the author of nature would never write surprise endings. Listen to these words from the preface to Newton's famous book, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, on which all elementary physics courses today are based. Here's how it was put in that preface. "The business of true philosophy is to derive the natures of things from causes truly existent, and to inquire after those laws on which the great creator actually chose to found this most beautiful frame of the world, not those by which he might have done the same, had he so pleased." And Newton continued, "Anyone presumptuous enough to think that he can learn the laws of nature from pure reason must either suppose that the world exists by necessity," which I would interrupt myself and say that's what a modern cosmologist like Max Tegmark seems to believe, that the world exists by necessity. And as Newton says, one must either suppose that the world exists by necessity, and by the same necessity follows the laws proposed, or if the order of nature was established by the will of God, that the person himself, a miserable reptile, can tell what was fittest to be done. Now, Robert Boyle, who helped to create the modern laboratory and its methods, said exactly the same thing. For if we believe God to be the author of things, it is rational to conceive that he may have made them commensurate rather to his own designs in them than to the notions we men may best be able to frame of them. Continuing on in this context, thinking of the biblical story of creation in which humans arrive on the scene at the end of the story, really, the end of the sixth day, after everything else is already there, Boyle comments this. He says, "The author of nature consulted not in the production of things with human capacities, but first made things in such manner as he was pleased to think fit, and afterwards left human understandings to speculate as well as they could." I think you get the drift. Yet another example from a more modern period comes from Michael Faraday, one of the most important scientists who has ever lived, and one of the most intensely religious. Late Cornell historian Pierce Williams, whom I knew, wrote the standard scientific biography of Faraday. Now, Williams was an unapologetic atheist, but he notes with admiration how Faraday drew more than strength from his religion. It gave him both a sense of the necessary unity of the universe, derived from the unity and benevolence of its creator, and a profound sense of the fallibility of man. Both are worth stressing. The origins of field theory are to be found in Faraday's detailed experimental researches on electricity. But the speculations and imaginings which led him to publish physical heresies owe something to his unquestioning belief in the unity and interconnections of all phenomena. This belief, in turn, derived from his faith in God as both creator and sustainer of the universe. As with each of these examples, for centuries, Christian theology has been closely linked with a humble attitude toward human knowledge and a genuine openness to finding wholly unanticipated, even seemingly irrational things in nature. And this is surely conducive to doing good science. Indeed, we have an identical opinion from none other than Thomas Henry Huxley, famously known as Darwin's bulldog, for his eagerness to defend Darwin's theory of evolution when it was still a brand new idea. He was certainly no Christian. Huxley coined the word agnostic to describe his own position, but he understood that science and Christianity have at least this much in common. Science seems to me to teach in the highest and strongest manner the great truth which is embodied in the Christian conception of entire surrender to the will of God. Sit down before fact as a little child. Be prepared to give up every preconceived notion. Follow humbly wherever and to whatever abysses nature leads, for you shall learn nothing. The relevance of the Christian understanding of creation for doing science should now be evident, but I will conclude with a complementary observation. Doing science actually enhances the Christian life, making one a better disciple of Jesus Christ. Hear Robert Boyle's palpable excitement in this passage about the telescope. Though heaven be an object that has been perpetually and conspicuously exposed to man's view and curiosity for some thousands of years, yet it still affords new subjects for their wonder. And I scarce doubt that by the further improvement of telescopes, posterity will have its curiosity gratified by the discovery both of new constellations and of new stars in those constellations that are known to us already. We need not therefore fear that our admiration of God should expire for want of objects fit to keep it up. That boundless ocean contains a variety of endless objects that is as little to be exhausted as the creatures that live in our sublunary ocean or lie on the shores that limit it can be numbered. Yet even this pales in comparison with the sheer rapture that fills Kepler's works from cover to cover. I have to confess, Kepler's my all-time favorite scientist. For it is precisely the universe, Kepler said, which is that book made, in which God the Creator has revealed and depicted his essence and what he wills with man in a wordless script. Or as he said on another occasion to a Roman Catholic colleague in astronomy, since we astronomers are priests of the Most High God with respect to the book of nature, it behooves us that we do not aim at the glory of our own spirit, but above everything else, at the glory of God. Christianity encourages scientists to seek the glory of God and the charitable service of our fellow human beings, rather than self-aggrandizement, which I suggest is an ever-present danger for top scientists. As Boyle realized, the higher degree of knowledge that the scientist attains seems more likely to puff him up than to make him humble. And he noted how the challenges of laboratory life could teach one humility instead. This reminds me of Francis Bacon's famous advice about the book of God's word and the book of God's works, namely that we should endeavor an endless progress or proficience in both. Only let men beware, he said, that they apply both to charity, that is to love, works of love, and not to swelling, that is to ego building. That they apply them to use and not to ostentation, not to showing off. And that again, that they do not unwisely mingle or confound these learnings together. So I close then with Boyle's advice to fellow scientists. In an age when so many people allow differences of opinion to degenerate into vulgar name calling. And you can ask me afterward if I think we're going back into that again. Boyle cautioned people as follows: railing at a man's person or wrangling about his words is a quarrelsome and injurious way of writing that does very much misbecome both a philosopher and a Christian. Thanks for your kindness in listening to those remarks. I'm looking forward to hearing yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. We will open the floor up again to more questions. Again, feel free to use the raise hand button through the participants window, or private message a question to myself or Dr. Davis. Chris, do you have a question? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Davis, for this wonderful lecture. You know, being a STEM major, I do quite enjoy the historical arguments for science and Christianity. Though I do have to say that the question I have is that, you know, in this lecture, you talked about a lot of famous scientists, their beliefs in Christianity, and how, you know, math and physics sort of elegantly predicts the universe and sort of evidence for you know, an intellectual higher being. My question is, how does this science specifically point to the existence of a Christian God and not just some ambiguous higher being or creator that you know, has no sort of interest in us?
I certainly made little attempt to do that. Most of the talk was of a type of you could call it a type of apologetic. I'm not sure it's natural theology, but a type of apologetic in which I was interested in showing how a robust theism was conducive with scientific practice and with indeed scientific ideas in many cases. So sure, that's a fair commentary on the limitations of this talk. I didn't really attempt to create it specifically with Christian beliefs until near the end, as you saw. And in those cases, I think it's a case where science can be helpful to the Christian rather than the other way around. In other words, the Christian already has a particular moral and spiritual agenda, and the practice of science can enhance that. So really, that I wasn't really trying to show there anything that science, you know, produces this agenda, or that Christianity does something to science in that regard. Simply the question that science can enhance the Christian faith in return, if you will. By and large, my views on this are that the Bible tells how to go to heaven and not how the heaven goes. Galileo. Quoting, by the way, a Vatican cardinal. Most people don't think of it as Galileo. They think of him as Galileo saying it himself, but he tells you he's quoting a Cardinal Baronio, who had been the Vatican librarian. and that was apparently no longer living when Galileo.
So I have a question in the chat, Dr. Davis. So to quote it, as a historian, what do you make of the claim that as human knowledge has progressed and our understanding of the mechanics of the universe has progressed, Christians have moved away from a literal interpretation of the Bible, primarily to save their faith?
I understand why that's the appearance, and that would be particularly the case if one listens strongly to contemporary creationists. That is the kind of, not the kind of creationist I was talking about, who believed in the universe as a divine creation, but the type of creationist who thinks everything was made 6,000 years ago in 6 literal days. Now, I would just say that you better be careful in looking at that, what we mean by a literalism. Because if you read the church fathers on interpreting Genesis, in many cases, the last thing you find is literalism. What you tend to see is various interpretations of that narrative, without uniformity on what is the literal translation. In fact, when Augustine around the 380s AD writes 3 different works, all titled similarly on the literal interpretation of Genesis, he concludes that the Genesis days, for example, really can't be understood as ordinary days. They can't be. The literal meaning isn't the literal meaning. In other words, it's not. It can't be that days actually refer to solar ordinary days. He makes arguments about this partly because the first 3 days of creation, the sun and moon aren't even there yet. They're not made until the 4th day, and it's on the 4th day that they're given the responsibility of ruling over the day and the night and separating the light from the darkness. That's one reason, but there's other reasons as well, including the fact that he thinks he's influenced by a school of thought among the fathers at the time, coming out of Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish scholar from the 1st century, who believed that God had made all of the creation in an instant, in a moment of time, and that it had unfolded from there, it had developed from there, and that God wouldn't possibly have taken 6 days to do this. So that's the school Augustine was coming from at this point. So he thought that the 6 days were an accommodation to our ignorance, the story we're given so that we can understand a little bit of what this deep, deep mystery was about, this mystery of creating the world. So I would just caution one about escaping from a literal interpretation, because if you go back to the earliest years of the Christian church, and so I'm told, although I don't know this material myself, the pre-Christian conversation among Jewish scholars, you find considerable divergence of opinion on just Genesis and what that literal interpretation actually is.
Awesome. If anybody else has a question, again, feel free to raise your hand or put your message in the chat. Have you received any questions on your end, Dr. Davis?
Let me look. No, there's nothing in the chat right now.
Gotcha. All right. Well, if nobody else has any other questions, we'll wrap things up now, but feel free to stick around after if you think of one. But thank you all again for being here today. Please join me again in giving a virtual round of applause or a thumbs up, whatever, to Dr. Davis. Thank you so much for being here today. And thank you. And Chris, I'll throw it over to you real quick just to wrap things up also.
Yeah, sure. Thank you all for coming, and thank you again, Dr. Davis, for speaking. I suppose I'll wrap it up by saying ways you can get involved in the Apologia. Joe, is that your intention in passing it over to me?
Sure, that sounds good. And I'll note real quick too that this lecture will be posted on the Apologia YouTube if you want to watch it again later, or just send it to a friend. I'll put the link to that channel in the chat while Chris speaks.
Sure. So ways to get involved in the Apologia for the coming year. We have since gotten rid of our Tuesday weekly discussion meetings in light of our spring issue coming out. We have replaced that time slot with the editorial board meetings so that we can really hone in on our editing skills to produce, as high quality of an issue as possible for the spring. But as I mentioned before, the best way to get involved at this point is to, please send us submissions for articles. If you have, like I said, a paper that you wrote for a class that you think can adapt well to the journal, or if you just have some sort of any burning thoughts you'd like to put to paper and publish. And in addition to that, other ways to help out with the magazine. If you are interested in editing and maybe you're an English major and have some experience with editing, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, we're always looking for art submissions, original photography, as well as anybody that has InDesign experience and would like to help out with, laying out the journal. And like I said, if you're interested in any of that, just feel free to reach out to me or to email the Dartmouth Apologia email. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Thank you all again for being here today. And that concludes the lecture. Feel free to stick around if you have any questions for Chris or for Dr. Davis. And hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you all.